It's 1994. A Floridian woman named Diane Dicer is about to take a bite out of her delicious grilled cheese sandwich when she stops and sees the visage of the Virgin Mary staring back at her in the grill pattern. Cueing in that this is a divine sign, she holds on to the half-eaten sandwich for 10 years, during which time it brings her all manner of luck, culminating in her sale of the sandwich on eBay for $28,000. Now, this was, of course, by no means the only instance of this type of accidental symbolism causing a massive cultural reaction. In 2012, there was a scar in a tree that also looked like the Virgin Mary, and that spawned a massive pilgrimage to its location. A woman in Ohio saw Jesus in a pierogi that she prepared on Easter, and there have been at least 3 instances of people seeing Jesus in a Cheeto. But cognitive scientists have suggested that this type of cognitive overinterpretation has been around since much longer than the grilled cheese or the humble Cheeto. And Stuart Guthrie, who's one of the earliest pioneers of the cognitive science of religion, has suggested that this phenomenon has been instrumental in humankind's earliest religious beliefs. In his book, Faces in the Clouds, Guthrie argues that this tendency to see agents where none actually exist is the product of a very natural and evolutionarily adaptive feature of our minds. Now, to understand this, it's important to recognize one of the most basic principles of evolutionary psychology, and that's that our minds are not built for accuracy or truth. They're not built to be an accurate one-to-one representation of the world. They're built for survival. And what that means is that our brain does all manner of pre-processing of the sensory information that comes into our sensory organs before we have the subjective experience, such that by the time we have that experience, let alone the interpretation of that sensory information, it's already been translated into something that best serves our goals of reproduction and survival. Now, perhaps the most obvious examples of that process are visual illusions, where you can actively see the tricks that your mind is playing on you. But those illusions are only one of the many ways that our brains distort the world.
One of the other ways we do this is by seeing patterns where there aren't any, something called pareidolia. And one of the most frequent patterns we see is that of agents, animate beings. And this is why we see faces in the clouds, and figures in the stars, and saints in sandwiches. Excuse me, can I get the sandwich to go? From an evolutionary perspective, having such a system in which we're on a hair trigger to perceive agency is sensible. No system is going to be 100% accurate, perfectly attributing every sound and movement to its appropriate source. And so the system is going to have to be more tuned to make the error of overperception or the error of underperception. That is, seeing agents when there actually are none, or missing agents that are actually there. And evolution would guide that system to be tuned to make the least costly of those 2 errors. So imagine you're a vulnerable human walking through a forest and you hear a branch snap. Now, what is the more costly of the 2 errors? To assume that that was a predator when there isn't one, or to assume that there's nothing there when it actually was a predator? Clearly the less dangerous thing is to make the error of overdetection, assuming that there's something there when there isn't. The cost of that is that you've just unnecessarily engaged the fear response. But the cost of the other thing, the error of underdetection, where you're missing the predator that's actually there, is that you become lunch.
And so humans are outfitted with a mind that's tuned to overperceive agency, seeing random events in nature, be they tides or clouds or stars or grilled cheese sandwiches, as the product of agents with minds. Now, Justin Barrett has called this the hyperactive agency detection device. And he and Guthrie and others have made the point that this tendency to overinfer agency likely underlies our tendency to infer gods and spirits in the natural world. So especially in the absence of a scientific explanation for things like the wind and the tides and the rising of the sun and the moon, the human mind would have immediately inferred supernatural agency behind these natural events. Hence, wind spirits and sun gods were born in our prehistory. But the hyperactive agency detection device, or the HAD, was only one of a suite of cognitive features that led humans to perceive gods in the world. Another is what's called promiscuous teleology. Now, teleology refers to the assumption that there's a purpose behind why things exist, and promiscuous just means that this tendency overfires. So here's developmental psychologist Justin Barrett to explain a little more about that.
Humans from childhood appear to really readily think in terms of what's it for? What's its design? What's its purpose when we think about stuff in the natural world? So Kellerman has done all of these really clever experiments across cultures now and with lots of different age groups, finding that it looks like we have a natural disposition when we'll see an animal or a plant or even a river or a mountain to wonder, well, what's it for? And to think that might be part of why it's here. So if I think a tiger is for being seen at the zoo, which in her studies she's got kids saying, yeah, it's here so that it can be seen at the zoo or other kinds of things like that. Well, that's why the first ever tiger existed, which to an adult sounds really bizarre. But she's managed to document this pretty thoroughly. And even in adults, explaining natural stuff in terms of what's it's for seems to be what we resort to if we have to answer very quickly, or we're under what are called conditions of cognitive load, where there's too much going on and I'm not really focused. Then I go to these functional, purpose, design-based explanations. Well, it's also the case she's shown that design-based thinking is really easily connected up with intentional. Who designed it? Did someone design it with that particular purpose? And so putting those kinds of natural dispositions together with the idea that the sort of super knowing, super perceiving, invisible, immortal kinds of beings are pretty easy. If that one happens, it also help account for why it is that there's stuff looks designed. It's a creator God, not a problem. Little kids go, oh, it's almost like they're sitting around and they've got this sort of conceptual, these conceptual spaces that are just a product of the way that human minds naturally develop in ordinary human environments. So the way that our mind develops has these little gaps that are just looking for the right cultural input to fit in that space. And so it might be the case that looks like there's evidence that it's the case that children have something that's a little bit like a God-shaped space. And I don't mean, a Judeo-Christian God, capital G necessarily, but by God here I mean invisible beings that are super knowing, super perceiving, help me understand why it is that there's stuff around that looks like it's here for a reason or a purpose. Well, if the cultural environment introduces that kind of God concept, no problem, it goes right in. It looks like that children have a natural predisposition to see design and purpose in the world. That seems to be crying out for an explanation. Who done it? Who accounts for why the mountains and rivers and trees and animals look like they have a purpose? They're here for a reason. And surely that's not humans. In fact, other studies have shown by the time kids are 4, they're very clear humans cannot account for that purpose. So there's this big whodunit, this question that needs answered in the minds of kids and minds of all of us, it looks like, just naturally. So in that sense, children may be really naturally receptive to certain kinds of religious concepts. And that could help account for why they're so easy to teach to children and why they're so persistent across time and across cultures. It's still an open question, though, empirically, an open question in terms of just what exactly is the shape of this conceptual space. Do ancestor spirits sort of fit that space? Well, they do seem to account for some of the stuff that we see in the natural world, if we're in that kind of cultural environment. So maybe they're a pretty good fit. Do you need a creator God of the cosmic sort? I don't know. Do you need lots of gods? Or is one God preferable? These are all open empirical questions. And exactly how those different properties fit together and whether it becomes too counterintuitive, even if each of the individual properties are not so counterintuitive, if you put them all together, is that too much? Or is that better? We don't know yet. These are just open empirical questions. That's what's really fun about working in this area, is it's a young enough field that there's all kinds of research to be done, lots of questions to be answered.
So one thing to note about both the had and promiscuous teleology is that they are ideas that are rooted in the byproduct hypothesis of religion's evolution. So recall that Slingerland contrasted the adaptationist hypothesis which holds that humans have specially evolved genetic adaptations for religious beliefs, with the byproduct hypothesis, which suggests that religious beliefs are the consequences of evolved genetic adaptations that we have for different reasons. Both the had and promiscuous teleology are examples of the byproduct hypothesis. They were adaptations that served their own purposes, but as a consequence, as a byproduct, they led to religious thinking. In other words, in this view, our ancestors weren't selected for because they believed in gods. They were selected for because they could perceive agency and purpose in an environment that was full of active and plotting minds. The fact that such a system also led them to perceive active and plotting gods was actually just a happy accident.